Welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle. You're all so welcome to join us in considering the idea of those who have gone before. And this week we are celebrating in advance the passing of a really important person named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And we're so fortunate to have speaking today Judy Saltzman. And she is a professor who has taught in California extensively and has given lectures and presentations at events actually around the country and around the world. She almost made her way to the East-West Center for her education here in UH Manoa, and she instead decided to stay in California for very good reasons. She, to me, has a lot in common in a certain way with Blavatsky herself. She is very much of an independent thinker. She is also an extremely broad thinker. So she has taught in philosophy and religion, and she has delved deeply into many of the world's religions and philosophies. And when I say deeply, I mean like encyclopedically. She amazes me in that way, which is something that Helena Petrovna Blavatsky certainly exemplified in the extreme. She is also a very adventurous person. H.P. Blavatsky, as you'll see, led an adventurous life around the world and was very active. She was a skilled horsewoman. She, in the course of her world travels alone, at some point even seems to have been in war zones, perhaps doing service as a medic. And Judy herself has many athletic skills, and she's a black belt in some of the martial arts. So she's somebody who has a very balanced yin and yang nature. She has that Sophia-like love of wisdom from the feminine side, and she has that more yang energy of really being very bold in everything that she has done in her lifetime. So it's really with great pleasure and honor I introduce Judy Saltzman to speak to us about H.P. Blavatsky, whose death anniversary we actually will celebrate 1 week from today. And in the meantime, we are honoring those who have gone before. So Judy, I hand it over to you.
Very well, thank you very much, Renee, for that introduction. I'm very glad to be speaking to this group about H.P. Blavatsky. I always love to talk about her. She is such an amazing person of the 19th century and for the centuries to come. And let me just first tell you a little bit about the life of this remarkable person. She was born in Ekaterinoslav, which is in the Ukraine, but it was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And I'm here that her house has actually been made into a shrine by the Ukrainians. I have some ULT colleagues that visited that a few years ago. And she was born on the Russian Orthodox calendar at midnight between August 11th and 12th. And this was in 1831 in the 19th century. And she was the daughter of a Russian army officer, Peter von Hahn, who was also, of course, descended from the Germans, and a Princess Dolgorukov. And she was actually a Contessa related to the Tsar of Russia, which aristocracy she later renounced. And she, from very early childhood, is said to have been quite amazed at paranormal powers that she had. Apparently, she could see auras of people. She was psychic, could read minds, and wasn't at first quite sure what this was all about. And her sister, who had apparently none of these powers, rather teased her and said that she was such an eccentric girl she liked to ride horses. She was a very good horsewoman because, of course, her father taught her how to ride. And this was helpful to her later in life. But on a dare, she married General Blavatsky, who was probably 40 or at least 20 years her senior. And at 17, she really did not care for the idea of marriage, tried to get out of it, and was nevertheless married and struggled against her husband's demands. And finally, I hear broke a candlestick over his head and escaped on horseback. Had to be seen for a number of years. Yes, there is a lot of humor in this. And she had visions before that and at that time of an Indian man named Moria, who later was revealed to her as her master. And she met him at Hyde Park in London at the age of 21. And he had incarnated in a human physical body and told her she must go to Tibet. Well, this was very difficult in those days because the British guarded the frontier. And she did finally, after a series of frustrations, get into Tibet with the help of Moria and went to see Kuthume, Moria's master. He's sometimes called the Great Master, who lived near the monastery at Shigatsu. And for a number of years, she was taught the ancient wisdom religion, which is called Theosophy or Theosophia, a term coined by Ammonius Saccas, who was the teacher of Plotinus in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And Theosophy is not really any religion, any one science. It is a universal teaching granted to all of humanity. Well, she learned Theosophy and she learned an ancient secret language called Senzar. Now, there is not any absolute scientific proof of her study in Tibet except for her remarkable writings. If you read these writings, which are thousands of pages, you will know they could not have been made up, as some people have actually claimed. And at any rate, she finally returned to Europe and had many talents. She was a concert pianist. She also spoke English. She learned that from a governess from York in England. She spoke French. She spoke German. She was extremely cultivated and learned. And she finally went to the United States. One of the reasons she went is that she felt that in the United States, there was a great melting pot of all the races that would eventually come together to form what she called the sixth subrace, one that would be far more peaceful than our own. Thank goodness that will hopefully happen eventually. And she went also because of the phenomena that were occurring in New England. The Fox sisters had made a big splash with the whole phenomenon of spiritualism. And there was a concern that there were spirits that were actually talking to human beings. Well, H.P. Blavatsky explained that these were not the dear departed, that they were actually simply astral phenomena that were picking up on the imagination of people. And this was tremendously helpful because getting into the astral, and especially entities that were either angry or sad, was not really comforting to human beings as much as they had hoped. And so she was able to explain many phenomena that were occurring spiritually. Well, she also went on from there after meeting a gentleman named Colonel Olcott, who had been a colonel during the Civil War, of course, on the Union side, and a young lawyer named William Q. Judge, and others, Abner Doubleday, the founder of baseball, and others, formed a society in 1875 in New York. And this was very important because it formed at least a group with certain principles, the first of which is the main principle in Theosophy, universal brotherhood. Well, of course, that also means sisterhood, because in Theosophy, of course, we are all minds, manas, and we are all manusha. We have 5 fingers, so we are, unlike animals with paws, we're able to do many things technologically, and we're also self-reflective beings. So this actually means men and women, and equality of men and women, which was not very much heard of in 1875. And the second principle was the unity of all religions. I mean, religions on the surface have many different rules, laws, and customs. We know that. But in reality, if you look at the mystical traditions, such as in Hinduism, Islam, or especially Gnostic Christianity, or a Christian like Meister Eckhart, what he's saying is very much like what Shankaracharya, the Hindu sage, was saying, or very much like some of the great Sufi mystics. So this was an important principle in Theosophy. And then, of course, they tried to constantly investigate not only what science was discovering empirically, but what was behind science. Science doesn't recognize the soul of things, or the astral of man, or the higher consciousness of man, especially reductionist psychology, behavioral psychology, but real Hindu psychology. And she very much wanted to bring the Eastern tradition into the West and unite East and West. Of course, does teach that there is a soul, and there is a design body, an astral, and there is a higher consciousness, the Atman, which Emerson had already written about in the American Renaissance in his essay, The Oversoul, because some of these ideas had gotten into the Western world through the translation of the Upanishads and the Veda by F. Max Muller, Sir Manier Williams, and others. So this was important. Well, eventually she needed to go back to India, and she did, quite to the sorrow of her colleague, William Q. Judge, who was left alone to promulgate Theosophy in New York. But she went to India and was greeted there by T. Subaro, Damodar K. Mavalankar, and other great teachers as a sage and as a great teacher. And the Theosophical Society was formed at Adyar, where she stayed for quite a few years, but she eventually left there with some satisfaction, which is too complicated to go into, and some great dissatisfaction as well over problems that occurred there in the Theosophical Society. But nevertheless, she and Colonel Olcott did teach there. And then on her return to the United States, she became an American citizen. She's the first Russian to become an American citizen. And at that time, I guess she didn't know whether General Blavatsky had died or not, but the judge asked her if she was married, and she said, "No, I'm a widow, a blessed widow." And at any rate, there was no problem in her becoming a citizen of the US and totally renouncing any claim to be an aristocrat or a contessa. And she did not agree with these kind of distinctions at all. And another thing, she always worked. At times, she worked in a necktie factory. She never wanted to gain money or recognition for herself. I mean, she was corresponding secretary of the Theosophical Society. Colonel Olcott was the president. Abner Doubleday, I think, was the vice president. She eventually traveled all over the United States and studied phenomena like American Indian shamanism. She also went to Canada. She studied voodoo, which of course deals a great deal with astral phenomena, their involvement with spirits and such. And, you know, there is something to these things, but they are not exactly what the practitioners of them think they are, according to H.P. Blavatsky. And in her final years, she stayed in London. Unfortunately, the body she inhabited was afflicted with Bright's disease, which caused edema. So there apparently was a great deal of suffering in that body. Nevertheless, she stayed as long as she could until May 8th, 1991, and she died. And her legacy was carried on in I think, the truest manner by William Q. Judge, to whom she was closest. Although there are different groups in Theosophy that have different views about this. Now, just to mention a few things about her teachings, because she wants to be known by her work. I mean, Judge says you don't try to understand her as a person. She is really too far beyond us for us to fully understand. But her work, The Voice of the Silence, is very important. It's a translation of fragments from the Book of the Golden Precepts in Senzar. And are you holding up your phone, Ella? Do you want me to stop?
No, you're good.
Okay, I'll just
You're doing great.
just for a few more minutes. And The Voice of the Silence is very important because it teaches a Mahayana Buddhist path of renunciation to take the spiritual path, beginning with living to benefit mankind, and then practicing the 6 precepts, glorious virtues, which include balancing karma and patience and other virtues. And it also teaches that compassion is a law of laws, that it isn't something that should be thought of later. No one can take the theosophical path and plan on just getting this wisdom for themselves. It is to be given out to humanity. That she is an example of that. Another of her works, which is very good for a beginning student, is The Key to Theosophy, which is a dialogue between H.P. Blavatsky and an inquirer. We don't know who that is. It might be William Q. Judge, who was very close to her and was around at the time that her great work, The Secret Doctrine, was written. In 1878, she shocked the literary world with a book called Isis Unveiled, which is a 2-volume work. And this work is just amazing. It is a dialectic against scientific materialism, which was very strong in the 18th century, with the coming on of Darwin and scientific rationalism, the beginnings of Freudian psychology, and reductionism, that human being is nothing but a featherless biped and advanced animal, advanced ape. And there were debates at this time. It's said that Bishop Wilberforce, who was a very good man, a Christian, once debated Thomas Henry Huxley. And what's remembered most about this debate was an ad hominem in which Wilberforce said to Professor Huxley, "Do you trace your lineage from the ape on your mother or your father's side?" This caused great amusement at Oxford. At any rate, she teaches that there is a different way of looking at our relationship to the ape, which has to do with the early races of man, which I can explain if you want. There are also her collected writings, which are from the magazine Lucifer, of course, which is a title rather shocking to Christians. And she corresponded with the Archbishop of Canterbury and others about it. Lucifer actually brings bringer of light. And there is, even in Matthew 10, evidence that even Jesus of Nazareth is identified as Lucifer, and right, he is a solar deity in the Hebrew Yehoshua. And Lucifer was an amazing magazine, and it's now in her collected writings, 3 volumes. And then, of course, the great work is The Secret Doctrine, which was actually 4 volumes, but only 2 are published because there were so many problems in the Theosophical movement. So many people were selfishly wanted to using it, the ideas for themselves, that she didn't want to give out the other 2 volumes, although she said they're nearly complete. And no one that I know knows where they are. Probably someone does. So her teaching, essentially, aside from the 3 aims of the Theosophical Society, the secret doctrine has 3 basic principles: the idea of cosmogenesis, how did the cosmos start, and anthropogenesis, how did humanity start. And what is most essential about the secret doctrine are the 3 fundamentals in the proem: an omnipresent, eternal, immutable, boundless principle, which we could call God or the deity, or um, in the Kabbalah, the Ein Sof. But no one knows exactly what this is. No human mind that we know of knows what it is. Even the masters don't claim to know. And they are the ones that gave out the secret doctrine, the ones who have gone before us. And also, the secret doctrine posits the idea of law, the fundamental manifestation through many levels into cycles of existence. And we're experiencing cycles of existence right now. We are in an age, according to the Hindu doctrine, called the Yuga, the Dark Age, in which there are 4 ages. There's the golden, the silver, the bronze, and we're in the Dark Age. We're in an age which everything is moving fast, but in which there's a great deal of violence, a great deal of selfishness, and a great deal of materialism, which we're trying to overcome in Theosophy. And then finally, being, the welling up of I am I. I mean, in a sense, this, you'll find this also in the philosopher Hegel and the philosopher Spencer, and not very popular philosophers in the modern era at the moment, but you will find these ideas in Hegel of idea, nature, spirit, and that we are the beings who are self-consciously aware and can become more aware of our origin. But we must continue to grow constantly. I mean, growth is infinite, and if we are going to ever become that, or the Tat Ekam of the Hindus, or the Al-Haq of the Muslims, the real, this is really an infinite growth that we're involved in, and as we move through the cycles. And so I guess probably her basic teaching is the human being is not separate from deity. I mean, in a sense, our inner human being is an inner God if we could understand it, and if we could learn to live by it. So, what she taught, of course, in her day caused a great deal of consternation and even anger from the powers that were in power. But she is considered the mother of the modern spiritual movement. Even academics call her the mother of New Age religions. And she has been accused of all sorts of unfortunate ideas, which are not at all hers if you really read her. And I have read thousands of pages of what she wrote, and she changed my entire life. After I read Isis Unveiled, and I don't know why, because she doesn't speak of this reincarnation in there. But after reading Isis Unveiled all night, I had this sudden flash of insight that I had always existed in some form. And it was like a light bulb going on in my head. I was about 25 or 6 at the time, and I have lived with that ever since and tried to grow with it. So she had a great deal of influence on my life and many people that I know. And so I'd really like to hear what you think about her. And I do hope that you will read some of what she has to say because you know her by her works. You can't really fully understand her as a being. According to William Q. Judge, she is too far beyond us, but yet she also says, I'm not a high adept. She said that her disciples in the uh, dialogues on the secret doctrine. Secret Doctor Diet. So I would really love to hear your questions about this or your comments. And thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Judy. You can, I think, everyone here tell from Judy's presentation that she's not only very learned on the subject of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and her teachings, but she's also been deeply touched at the heart and spiritual level by her. She certainly seems to have been someone of enormous compassion. She was, she kind of marched into these battles against the science of the time, which was very materialistic, and against the religion of the time, which was very dogmatic. And so she was fighting on two different fronts. She was maligned on both sides. She also took on these people called the spiritualists that were, as Judy was mentioning, going into seances and kind of just messing around in probably what were rather dangerous waters to be treading in. And she only did this just to bring more light to the human condition. She had done so much studying of all these deep philosophical and religious traditions that she had so much to share that could really help us in all of our divisions against one another to see what is at the heart, what the unity is of all of these great teachings. So we're appreciative to Judy for sharing some of that and for showing some of the ways in which HPB was helpful to the world. I love a story in which she was set to travel across the ocean, and I think she was in England traveling to America, and she had a first class ticket. And she encountered a young mother and her two children who was sobbing. She had tickets for the three of them with the money that her husband had sent over for them to join him in America. And she had been swindled out of those tickets. And now here they were, penniless and no way to get back to the husband and father. And just on the spot, Helena Blavatsky goes up to the ticket office, trades in her first class ticket for 4 tickets down in steerage underneath the boat, and joins them for that long and no doubt miserable journey that got all of them over to America. And one gets the feeling that that's the kind of kind deed that she probably was doing all the time. It went unrecorded, but I love that one got recorded.
That's a great story. Yes, I know that story. And also, she took in some orphans and was even accused of having had a child out of wedlock because of that. And I mean, she actually could not have had a child, according to a doctor's examination of her. She was really more of an androgen than a woman. And this was certified by a medical doctor. And she also took in a couple in India who betrayed her. And she knew that would happen, but she said, even if a snake comes to your door, you must feed it knowing it will bite you. So she was of a very kind nature, really, a bodhisattva, actually. And yet, there are all sorts of misguided ideas about her and misunderstanding her writings, but you need to read a great deal of her writings in context. And the first book I read was The Key to Theosophy, which I didn't understand. I think I was lying out in the sun, just sort of reading it and thinking, oh, this is very curious at first, and not understanding it very well. But
Uh,
that is one of the best introductory books because she tries to answer questions about life after death and what's wrong with modern education, and questions that people would ask that were essentially lost souls and didn't know what to do.
hmm.
Judy, you have unique insight also. There was a young person studying to be a barrister in London, and some vegetarians, he was a Hindu, some vegetarians asked him, living in London, whether he'd like to join us, et cetera, et cetera. But the upshot is they took him to a London Theosophy lodge where he met H.P. Blavatsky and changed his whole life. That was Mahatma Gandhi.
Mhm.
But
Wow.
Judy, could you tell us about Einstein and the secret doctrine? Because you have a unique insight into it.
Well, where I learned about Einstein and the secret doctrine was from a gentleman named Dr. Ernest Sternglass. So this was 20 years ago. I brought him to the Institute of World Culture. And I think we needed to meet in a private home at that time because there'd been a fire at the Institute. But Dr. Sternglass had met Einstein as a young man. And he had been invited to a Vedanta conference. He was a little bit surprised about this, Dr. Sternglass was, because he was Jewish. He didn't know anything about Vedanta, but he had written a book on Georges Lemaitre's The Primeval Atom, and the Hindus thought this was very much like the Hindu idea of the evolution of the cosmos. Well, Dr. Sternglass, as a young man, got to stay for a whole day and visit with Einstein at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And he said there was a big blue book which Einstein had at the right corner of his desk. And Einstein, he said he had it there all the time and consulted it regularly. What was this book? And I said, that's the secret doctrine. I had read this somewhere else. And there were insights that he thought had preceded the theory of relativity, because even before relativity, she wrote that with the beginning of the Aquarian age, which was around 1900, there would be enormous changes in what physicists thought of the universe. And of course, the theory of relativity was developed in 1906, and now there are even problems with theory of relativity. It doesn't quite fit with quantum mechanics, and they've tried to develop a theory of everything, which hasn't quite worked yet, according to what I have read. I am not a physicist, of course, but Dr. Sternglass very much wanted a copy of this book, and I sent him one. I didn't get a chance to see him again, but he was also made a big splash up here in San Luis Obispo because he spoke at Cal Poly against Diablo Canyon, the nuclear power plant, which is about 15 miles downwind from me. And hopefully it will be closed in 4 years. It is something I've probably cooked. That's all right.
I'm seeing that we have Vina Howard here. It's so nice to see you, Vina. I know you and Judy have met one another on many an occasion,
Good
different
friend.
conferences.
Hi, Judy. Hi, Renee. Hi, everyone. Judy,
Hi,
that was great. It's so good to see you. So wonderful. Thank you. I was going to pick on Maurice's question, and you started with a young barrister in England. And that young barrister also wrote a book in 1909, Hind Swaraj, which was a inquirer, reader, and the editor. I never thought about it until Judy mentioned today. I wonder if Gandhi was influenced by that hermeneutic, that method of writing, that you see in Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. Can you make that connection, Judy, or is it, or I'm just reading too much into your comment?
Well, I'm not sure that I could comment on Gandhi's method of writing. However, I do know, I remember I heard Raghavan Iyer speak once about that when Gandhi was on a ship headed for England, he met two brothers who were Theosophists. And Gandhi, for some reason, had not read the Bhagavad Gita. And they had. And they, Westerners, actually told Gandhi about the Gita. And of course, it was enormously important to his eventual development of satyagraha, you know, what the war was really all about, not only his idea of nonviolence, but the inner struggles spiritually that we all go through. And now, as far as a style in writing, I'm not really sure, but I do know that he once made a statement, in spite of his enormous tolerance and love for all the really true religious traditions of this world he had in his ashram, that he thought that theosophy, the universal way, was the ultimate way, that we all had to somehow come together on the mountain on the way up. In other words, Swami Vivekananda says, well, all meet at the top of the mountain. Well, Gandhi, and I think Theosophy says we've got to meet before we get there and see ourselves as one and not as separate, not as my religion, your religion, his religion, etc. And also combine the best in science with the best in religion, and we cannot be dogmatic. Dogmatism in either materialism or some sort of religious doctrine have got to go. They have been so destructive to this world. So I can't fully answer your question, Vina, but I do think that in England, his meeting with Blavatsky was no doubt very influential on the young Mohandas K. Gandhi, and it made a huge difference in his life.
Thank you so much. I think that's because you don't see that in that kind of writing style generally. So I think I want to do a little more research about that. That I just taught that book, Hind Swaraj, and he does write on the ship. So why is he choosing that method of writing, and is it a reader and that? So it's pretty interesting. You know, I don't know, other people have questions. I have a question about parapsychological experiences. What does that mean? Because there is a professor, I think she's at Columbia University. She's writing on S.P. Blavatsky about secret doctrine. Why is it secret? What is the secret about it? So maybe something, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your question. Of course, Blavatsky did have paranormal faculties, which as a young woman, and when she was first in the US, she would demonstrate. I mean, she could control elementals. She could make some elementals do some knitting across the room. She could pass a cup through the wall. But she considers these to be very elementary. And then later on, she stopped doing this because people accused her of trickery, which was not the case. And she would just refuse after a while to do any of this stuff because people didn't believe it and thought she was a phony, because some of the seances, of course, were not real, and some of them were simply elemental phenomena. I mean, even on the West Coast, Leland and Jane Stanford got involved with a medium. And that is how, strangely enough, Jane Stanford thought her late son, Leland Stanford Jr., had come to her, I was told, as a child in a dream, but it was actually a seance. And he said to her, found a university in my name and make it as great as Harvard. Well, it was, of course, her own imagination that was making this astral entity say this, which she thought was her late son. and there was founded Stanford University, one of the most influential universities on the planet. And I'm afraid where a great deal of materialism is taught, but it has possibilities. They all do. If American education could gradually change and become more spiritual, we'd have a good chance. And I'm glad there are educators like Vina Howard and others who these ideas who are still teaching.
Can I call on Robert and then Kirk, who's have appeared on our screen?
Well, I was wondering whether, from your standpoint, whether, your own knowledge, what you think, how H.P. Blavatsky has affected the literature and science. You mentioned Einstein, but has the secret doctrine influenced other areas of science? And also, do you think the familiarity with the concepts of karma and reincarnation can be attributed to her work at all?
Well, karma in reincarnation, universal unity and causation, these are the four golden links. I mean, you can find these in the ancient literature of the Upanishads. You can certainly find them in Neoplatonism, in Christianity, in the teachings of Origin, or what you might call the alternative reality in the West. But I mean, she brought them into focus. Now, how much they influence science, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't fully understand Einstein, but I know when he debated Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle, he said to Heisenberg, I can't believe that God plays dice with the world. In other words, Einstein believed in a design of the universe very clearly. And of course, he was always looking for a unified field theory, which I think the secret doctrine teaches, which never fully came out in science. And like I said, Professor Stephen Hawking and others were trying to develop a theory of everything, which would unify quantum mechanics and relativity. And I don't think it's ever been fully succeeded in science, because science has to keep its hard-headed material views. Although some materialistic scientists, like even Carl Sagan, with whom I had dinner once, told me that he thought the ancient Hindus had discovered great truths about astronomy, which was a great admission from him. I mean, he was a materialist, although I think maybe in the next lifetime he's got a chance to move on from that. Let's hope so. As HPV says, the certain materialists will regret that they ever missed a station. We probably all missed a few in past lives. I think she's had more influence on science than some scientists would admit, but I don't know quite where Ernest Sternglass went after that. He was an older man when I told him about the secret doctrine, and that's what the book was, and I sent him a copy. I didn't hear from him again, and I got a lot of flack from my colleagues about having him speak, incidentally, because they were all for Diablo Canyon, some of them. And so far, we've got more radiation up here because of it, but we haven't died yet. So let's hope. Are there other questions?
I think would be next.
I was just a couple of quick comments. I think I'm not. Excuse me if I missed it, Judy, if you mentioned this or not. But one of the ideas that Blavatsky says was part of ancient philosophy and science was this idea of the equivalence of matter and energy, which which we now have in Einstein's famous equation, right? E equals mc squared. But she was, she had declared that long before that was an accepted idea in science. Just one example. But I also, I wanted to just make a comment in relation to Venus' question, because that whole idea about parapsychological or paranormal mental faculties and abilities, that was very much not just an interest of H.P. Blavatsky and capacities that she had, but the reason that, as far as I understand it, one of the reasons for her involvement with the mediums and seances that were going on at that time is because she felt that phenomena, that class of phenomena would open up the idea to the American or the Western mind that was very closed to the whole concept of there being, other levels of matter and of experience and of consciousness that were possible. So it was kind of this opening up, but at the same time, it was a misunderstanding of what that phenomena was. And
Yes.
so she not only wanted to clarify that, but she was also pointing to the enormous capacities in human nature in general, going back to things like the story of the Buddha in his awakening. And for example, his capacity to see the whole of his past lives, to see into deeper realms of nature. And this is also part of the idea that you find in the Vedas and Upanishads, of course, in regards to the seers. They're human beings who have developed their spiritual and mental capacities to such an extent that they can see through the veils of nature, which are otherwise impenetrable to us. And by doing that, they understand a deeper level of truth and reality. The ultimate reality, of course, being that of unity, right? So that is, sort of the underlining theme to all of her writings, you could say, is pointing to that the ultimate unity of all of nature, deity, and humanity.
Well, I think that is a very important point that Kirk is making. Yes, her interest in these phenomena was not just a side interest. I hope I didn't give that impression. It was very central to her because she could live on a number of different planes. I mean, like, for example, at night, instead of sleeping like the most of us, because she was an adept, she was the messenger of the masters, she was able to leave her body and go communicate with the masters. And one night, Constance Wachtmeister, who was a countess from Sweden, who was her companion in Germany, almost killed that body by waking her up suddenly. And she had to get back really fast because, like most of us, our astral just floats at night next to us. She could extend her astral where she wanted to on the planet. And she really did think that in the United States, there was an openness to these phenomena, not only because of the American Renaissance, but also because this is the seat, the melting pot of all the different races, and we will eventually come together as one American race, not only physically, but also psychologically. It can't happen soon enough, in my view. We're going to gradually evolve into, I hope, a much more peaceful people and a much more unified people, in spite of the enormous divisions that are occurring right now. So this is why, I mean, she chose to be an American. She chose to renounce aristocracy for equality. She chose to come to the United States, although she died in London, where it was possible for her to do a great deal of her work. But I think you're absolutely right, Kirk, and I can't fully explain her influence on science, but I have heard that there's a group at MIT that meets to discuss the secret doctrine and possible discoveries that will be made because of it. And I don't know this group particularly, but there is no doubt that the secret doctrine will be read perhaps more in the future than it is now.
Yeah, just one other really fascinating point to me about that is one of her colleagues, William Quan Judge, talked about this a lot, but also in the Key to Theosophy, she mentions that if we have the preconception that we're only going to live one life and that it's going to terminate when we die, that's going to actually influence our after-death experience, and can make it, as you were pointing out, a kind of blank, as opposed to being a journey, a part of the soul's journey through other states of matter and energy and consciousness, by which the soul eventually returns back into incarnation. So if you, so that the beliefs that we hold, quote unquote beliefs, can very much influence our experience, which now, science has demonstrated that too, right? That what it is you're attending to and paying attention to, that determines what you're going to see. Anyway, just thank you very much for the talk, both about her life and her teaching, Judy. Appreciate it.
Well, we can't go far enough into the depth of this being to fully understand her, but the teaching of reincarnation you mentioned is so important. Although initially, she doesn't just toss it down us. She talks about universal brotherhood, meaning universality for all men and women being important, and even our connection to the lower kingdoms. There are younger brothers. But I think that the problem is with nations that do not teach reincarnation is that there's a sense that, why should we worry about the environment? I mean, in 30 years, you'll be dead and I'll be dead and the earth will be dead. I remember there's a movie a few years ago called Beatrix at Dinner, which features a young woman who is poor. I mean, she does Reiki massage and she has dinner with some very wealthy people. And this man named Doug Strutt, it's sort of a parody of who's shot a rhinoceros and he's so proud of it. And she gets very angry at him for doing this terrible thing to this poor animal. And then he says to her just that, well, why bother? We're all going to be dead in 30 years. So who cares if the earth is dead? Well, this is so blatantly untrue. I mean, their children remember their past lives. I mean, there is a great deal of evidence, even scientifically, the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, that there are past lives and past lives memories, and the enormous differences in siblings would indicate that there is far more than genetic inheritance. And once you understand that consciousness is not going to end, or it's not going to go to heaven or hell, and people have been kept in bondage by religion because they're so afraid of hell, why would there be an eternal punishment for finite sins that is so illogical, or an eternal reward? But once you understand that we are part of the cycle of this great globe, and we need to return to that, and that everything we do now is going to affect our future. And not only that, if you read about the horrible fate of the suicide, I mean, it's not going to do you any good to commit suicide if you're depressed, because you're just going to float in a very bad after death state until the rest of that normal life is out, whether it's 20 years or 2 years. And even medically assisted suicide could do that. And, I think we've all had our depressed moments. So I know I have. But I absolutely realize that these kind of actions that I have had friends do, I mean, I'm very upset and sorry for them. It means that they're just going to have a horrible after death state, which will seem to be eternal, but it won't be, fortunately. So these teachings that she gives out, even in the key to Theosophy, which is in many ways very elementary, are extremely important to grasp before you go on.
Yes.
And I mean, I reread the key to Theosophy after first reading it. I realized I missed so much. I didn't have a clue when I first read it. As I said, I think I was lying out in the sun, drinking a Coke or something, and just saying, oh, what a strange book this is. Yes.
Yeah. So, Judy, really, you are so right. The depth of what we have to learn from H.P. Blavatsky is kind of unfathomable. And we really, really appreciate how much of it you've actually laid out for us, and how actually impactful it can be to the way that we choose to live our lives, and possibly quite far beyond that point in time. So it's really been an enormously helpful discussion that you've launched us into. But thank you all so much for joining us in today's discussion of H.P. Blavatsky, and especially to Judy Saltzman for her insightful, heartfelt comments. Thank you so much.
Huge
Thanks,
mahalas
Judy.
to all of you. Thank you so much.